She hated the human soldier, but his gentle heart broke her fear. Serath, the warrior princess of the Zorothian Empire, stood tall on the battlefield. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the war-torn landscape before her. The planet was a wasteland, a mere shadow of the lush green world it once was. Now, it was scorched, a place where only the strongest survived, and Serath was among the strongest. Her armor glinted under the dying sun, reflecting the harsh rays that barely pierced the thick smoke in the air. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This was a critical mission, destroying a human outpost that had been causing trouble for the Zorothian Empire for months. Today, she was determined to put an end to it. "Move forward," she ordered, her voice cold and commanding, as her troops rallied behind her. The sound of footsteps echoed as the Zorathian soldiers advanced, their weapons raised, ready for action. Serath's mind was sharp, focused on the task ahead. The humans were nothing more than weak creatures standing in the way of progress. Their civilization, a young one compared to her own, was no match for the power of the Zorathian Empire. But even so, there was a fire in her heart, an unshakable hatred for the humans. They were relentless, fighting in ways she could never understand. It was that very tenacity that made her despise them. The human soldiers fought with everything they had. Their primitive weapons weren't much compared to the Zorathians' advanced technology, but their spirit was something to be feared. Serath had seen it before. A small group of humans had managed to hold off a much larger Zorathian force in the past, and it had cost her soldiers their lives. She couldn't let that happen again. As they neared the human outpost, Serath's eyes locked onto the walls ahead. The humans had built a stronghold here, but it wouldn't be enough. It was just a matter of time before her forces would breach the defenses and wipe them out. With a fierce shout, Serath led the charge. Her soldiers followed, cutting through the enemy lines with surgical precision. The battle was brutal, but it was nothing Serath hadn't experienced before. She moved like a storm, her sword slashing through the air as she cut down anyone who dared to stand in her path. In the chaos, Serath's sharp gaze caught something unexpected. A human soldier standing alone at the edge of the battlefield. Unlike the others who were engaged in combat, he was still waiting. Her curiosity piqued. Serath made her way toward him. Her eyes narrowed in suspicion. This soldier didn't belong in the chaos. He stood as if he had already accepted his fate. The human soldier, clad in the standard armor of the Federation, met her gaze without flinching. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't beg for mercy. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" Serath demanded, her voice cutting through the noise of the battle. The human soldier didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly lowered his rifle, his hand shaking slightly. Serath could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Exhaustion not just from the battle, but from something deeper. "Private Mark Hastings," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "And I'm not here to fight." Serath was taken aback. She had expected him to beg for his life or scream in terror, but instead, he spoke with calm resolve. His words were almost peaceful. "Not here to fight?" Serath repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "Then why are you here?" Mark's eyes softened for a moment, and he let out a long sigh, as if he were carrying a heavy burden. "I'm here because someone has to stop this madness. All we're doing is killing each other. Over what? Land? Power? Nothing matters anymore. Sareth felt a strange unease settle in her chest. She wasn't used to hearing such words from the enemy. She had been taught that humans were nothing more than animals, fighting for survival, driven by their base instincts. Yet here was one of them, standing before her, speaking as though he understood something she didn't. "You think you can stop the war?" Sareth asked, her voice cold, but there was a flicker of curiosity hidden beneath the sharpness. Mark's gaze didn't waver. "I don't know if I can stop the war, but I can stop this fight. We've lost enough already. I've seen too many good people die for nothing." Sareth narrowed her eyes. What was this human trying to say? What kind of warrior was he to speak so freely about peace in the middle of battle? "You disgust me," Sareth snapped, stepping closer to him. "You humans are weak." "You speak of peace, but you hide behind your weapons, your technology. You've destroyed more than you've built." Mark's expression didn't change. He seemed almost, resigned, as though he had been expecting her to say something like that. "I'm not proud of what we've done," he said softly. "But I believe in something better. I believe we can be better." Sareth felt a pang in her chest, an emotion she couldn't name. It was foreign to her, this feeling of uncertainty, of doubt. For a moment she found herself questioning the words he spoke, questioning the purpose of the war that had consumed her life for as long as she could remember. "I don't need your words," Sareth spat, raising her sword. "You're nothing but a human soldier, and you'll fall just like the rest." But Mark didn't move. He stood there, his expression still calm. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't fight back. For a brief moment, Sarath hesitated. Why wasn't he afraid? Why wasn't he begging for his life like all the others? It was almost as if he wasn't afraid of her at all. Sareth quickly shook the thought away. This was war. There was no room for hesitation. She couldn't afford to show weakness. With a swift motion, she ordered her soldiers to take Mark prisoner. He would be interrogated later, and his fate would be sealed. But even as she turned away, her mind kept returning to his calm demeanor, his soft-spoken words. For the first time in her life, Sareth felt a strange, unsettling curiosity about the humans she had been taught to hate. Sareth's heart was heavy as she stared at the human soldier, Mark Hastings, locked behind the reinforced bars of the Zarathian prison cell. The sound of his steady breathing was the only thing that filled the quiet room. He had been captured during the battle, and now here he was, silent, still, unlike the others. Most prisoners begged, pleaded, or screamed in terror, but Mark had not. He had not even flinched when they dragged him away from the battlefield. The Zarathian guards stood at attention outside the cell, but Sareth barely noticed them. Her thoughts were consumed by the prisoner. She had no patience for weaklings, but Mark's calmness unsettled her. She had been raised to believe humans were nothing more than animals, fighting to survive by any means. But Mark, he was different. He had been so calm, so sure of himself. His words echoed in her mind. "I'm here because someone has to stop this madness." Sareth pushed those thoughts aside. He was still the enemy, a soldier who fought for a cause she could never understand. And yet, she couldn't forget the way he had looked at her during the battle. It was as if he saw something more than just an enemy. Something human. Something... But That was impossible. Humans had no place in her world. Princess Seraph? A voice broke through her thoughts. It was a guard, his tone respectful but firm. The prisoner is ready for questioning. Seraph nodded, her eyes still on Mark. She had planned to question him, but now she wasn't sure what she would ask. She stepped toward the cell, her armor clanking with each step. Mark didn't move, didn't look up, as though he had already accepted that this was where he would remain. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a hint of something beneath it, something she couldn't name. Tell me, human, why are you not like the others? Mark lifted his head slowly, meeting her gaze without fear. His eyes were tired, but there was no terror in them. I don't want to fight, he said simply. But I'll fight if I have to. Sarath's brow furrowed. You speak of peace in the middle of a war. Why? What do you hope to gain by such foolishness? Mark didn't answer right away. He looked at her as if considering how best to explain something that was so foreign to her. Because I believe in something more. Something better. I believe we can end this war, if we try. Sarath's anger flared. More? Better? The words were nothing but dreams. She had seen the destruction, the pain that war caused. She had seen her people's cities burn, their families torn apart. And now, here was this human, telling her that peace was possible. She had been raised to fight, to conquer, to never show weakness. Peace was for the weak. You speak as though you understand, Sarath said coldly, her fists clenched at her sides. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. You don't know what it's like to watch your world burn. Mark's expression softened. No, I don't. But I've seen enough pain to know it isn't worth it. We're all just fighting to survive, but we don't have to destroy each other in the process. There has to be another way. Sarath felt a wave of frustration surge within her. Why couldn't he just be like the others? Why couldn't he just be an enemy she could destroy and move on with? But here he was, speaking as though his words could somehow change everything. You think your words can change anything? Sarath asked, her voice rising. The war has been going on for decades. Generations have died for nothing. You think you can end it all with a few kind words? Mark didn't flinch. I don't think it'll be easy, but I think it's worth trying. Sarath's gaze hardened. I don't have time for your idealism. She turned away from the cell, signaling for the guards to take Mark to the interrogation room. As she walked down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this human was getting under her skin. The others she had captured had been easy to break, to bend to her will. But not Mark. He wasn't afraid, and that disturbed her more than she cared to admit. Hours later, Sarath stood before the interrogation room, staring at the door. She had told herself she would not let this human get to her. She would question him, find out what he knew, and then dispose of him like any other enemy. But even as she stood there, she knew it wasn't going to be that simple. She had ordered the guards to bring him in, and soon Mark appeared, walking with his head held high despite the shackles on his wrists. He was unfazed by his capture, and Sarath couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Sit, she ordered, gesturing to the chair in front of her. Mark obeyed, sitting down without hesitation. His calmness only made her more uncomfortable. What do you hope to achieve by this? Sareth demanded. You are just one human. You can't stop the war. Mark met her gaze. I don't have to stop the war. I just want to make sure it doesn't get worse. Sareth let out a bitter laugh. Worse? How could it possibly get worse? My people are dying. Your people are dying. What makes you think you can stop it? I don't know if I can, Mark replied, his voice steady. But I can't just stand by and do nothing. I won't give up on trying to make it better. Sareth's chest tightened. She had heard these kinds of words before, spoken by those who had given up everything for a cause. But they always ended up broken, shattered by the harsh reality of war. Mark was no different. He would learn the same lesson eventually. You're naive, she said quietly. War is the only thing that has ever brought change. Peace is an illusion, a lie. Mark shook his head. Maybe you're right. But I don't think that means we should stop trying for peace, even if it's just one small step at a time. Sareth stared at him for a long time. Her mind was a whirl of emotions she couldn't quite understand. He was so different from everyone else, so calm, so peaceful in the face of the destruction all around him. He was a soldier, yet he didn't seem to want to fight. He was everything she had been taught to despise, and yet he made her question everything she had ever known. The silence between them grew heavy, and for a moment, Sarath wondered if there was any truth to his words. Could peace truly exist in a galaxy consumed by war? Could a single person like Mark make a difference? But she quickly pushed those thoughts away. She couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. Not ever. As the interrogation ended, Sarath ordered Mark to be returned to his cell. Her mind was still spinning with confusion. His words lingered in her thoughts, challenging everything she had been taught. She could not allow herself to believe them, no matter how much she wanted to. She had been raised to fight, to conquer, and to never show weakness. But Mark Hastings had shown her something she couldn't ignore. The days dragged on, and Sareth could feel a change within her, an unfamiliar feeling that gnawed at her. It had been weeks since the battle, weeks since she had captured Mark Hastings. Since then, she had kept him locked away in the prison, away from the rest of her soldiers. He had not once tried to escape. He had not shown any fear, only calm resolve. And in his silence, he had managed to shake her, to make her question everything she had believed in. Each time Sarath passed by his cell, she felt the weight of his gaze follow her. There was something in his eyes, something she couldn't explain, that kept her from dismissing him as just another enemy. She had never felt this way before. She had always been certain of her beliefs, certain of her purpose in this war. But now there was doubt, and that was something Sarath could not afford. On the day the war took a sudden, unexpected turn, Sarath found herself on the battlefield again. This time, the Zarathian forces were not attacking an outpost. They were being attacked. The Federation, the very humans Sarath had grown to despise, had launched a full-scale assault on her fleet. The sound of explosions filled the air as Zarathian ships were destroyed, one after another, by human firepower. Sarath stood on the bridge of her flagship, her eyes fixed on the battlefield below. The chaos was overwhelming. Her fleet was being torn apart. Ships that had once been symbols of the Zorathian Empire's strength were now burning in the void. The Federation was relentless, and Sereth knew this battle could be their last. "Princess Sereth, we need to retreat," one of her officers called out, his voice filled with panic. "We can't hold them off much longer." But Sereth didn't move. She couldn't. She had fought for this moment for so long, fought to protect her people and her empire, and now it was all slipping away. The humans were winning. "No," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "We fight! We don't retreat!" But even as she said the words, doubt crept in. The humans were different now, stronger, more determined. She had seen it in Mark's eyes, and now she saw it in their actions. The war was no longer about conquering. It was about survival. Both sides were being destroyed, piece by piece. And it was all for nothing. Suddenly a message came through from the lower levels of the ship. It was urgent. One of the Zorathian ships had been boarded. The humans had managed to board their flagship. "Get to the lower levels," Sereth ordered, her voice sharp. "We can't let them take this ship." She grabbed her weapon and ran down the hall, her heart pounding. As she reached the lower levels, the sounds of battle filled her ears. Explosions shook the ship, and she could hear the clash of weapons as Zorathian soldiers fought to defend their ship. She rounded a corner and came face to face with a group of Federation soldiers. But they weren't just any soldiers. They were human prisoners. Humans who had been captured and held by the Zorathians for months, maybe longer. Sereth had seen them before, but this time they were different. They weren't running. They weren't scared. They were standing their ground, fighting back. The leader of the group stepped forward, a soldier Sereth had seen once before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes. It was Mark. He was holding a weapon now, his hands steady as he aimed it at her. For a moment, Sereth hesitated. She couldn't understand it. Why was he here? Why was he fighting against his own people? And yet, as their eyes met, she saw it. There was no fear in his gaze, only determination. He wasn't fighting for the Federation. He was fighting for something else, something greater. "Mark," Sereth said, her voice calm but unsure. "What are you doing here?" Mark didn't answer right away. He just watched her, as if weighing his options. "I'm here to stop this madness," he said finally, his voice steady. "I can't let you destroy everything. Not anymore." Sereth's chest tightened. Stop this madness. She had heard those words before, but now they felt different. Now they felt real. "You're a soldier?" Sereth said, her voice filled with confusion. "You should be fighting for your people, for your empire." Mark shook his head, his expression softening. "I don't fight for my empire anymore. I fight for something better. I fight for the future." The words hit Sereth like a blow to the chest. She had spent her entire life fighting for a future that she believed in, for a future where the Zorathian Empire ruled the stars. But Mark's words made her question everything she had known. Could there really be a better future? Was there more than just war and destruction? "Your people are dying," Sereth said quietly. "You're all going to die." Mark didn't flinch. "Maybe." But we don't have to die fighting each other. Sereth's heart pounded in her chest. She had never heard such words from a human. Had never thought she would hear words like this from anyone. Peace. Unity. A future without war. The thoughts were dangerous. Dangerous enough to make her feel something she couldn't name. For a moment, the two stood in silence, the sounds of battle raging around them. Mark didn't lower his weapon, and Sereth didn't raise hers. They were locked in a silent standoff, both unsure of what the next step would be. Then, suddenly, the ship shook violently, and the lights flickered. Sereth felt the floor beneath her feet tremble as another explosion rocked the ship. She didn't have time to think. She didn't have time to make a decision. Without thinking, she reached out and grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the escape pods. "Come on," she said, her voice sharp. "We have to get out of here. This ship's going down." Mark didn't argue. He didn't resist. He simply followed her, his footsteps heavy on the steel floor as they ran through the chaos. They reached the escape pods just as another explosion rattled the ship. The pod doors slid open, and Sereth quickly pushed Mark inside before following him. As the doors sealed shut, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, even though the battle outside raged on. The escape pod shot away from the ship, tumbling through space as the Zarathian flagship exploded in a fiery ball of destruction behind them. As they drifted in the void, Sereth stared out into the endless stars. The war was over for her, for now. But what came next? Where did she go from here? Mark sat next to her, silent, watching the stars as well. For the first time, Sereth didn't feel the weight of hatred in her heart. She didn't feel anger or fear. She just felt lost. And yet, in that moment, she realized something she hadn't before. The fight wasn't over. Not for her and not for Mark. But perhaps, for the first time, it didn't have to be about destroying the other side. Perhaps there was another way. The escape pod drifted silently through the stars, far from the wreckage of the Zarathian flagship. The battle had been intense, chaotic, an all-out assault that neither side had truly won. Sereth sat in the corner, her eyes gazing into the vast emptiness of space. She didn't know where they were headed, only that they had left everything behind. Mark sat beside her, his face unreadable, but there was a calmness in his eyes that she could not ignore. She had felt it when they ran to the pod, when they had escaped the explosion together. It was the same calmness he had shown when they first met. The same calmness that had unsettled her in the prison. The journey through space felt endless. But it was more than just the distance. There was a weight hanging between them, an unspoken understanding. Neither of them knew what to do next. They had survived the battle, but that was only the beginning. The war was still going on, and no matter where they went, the war would follow. After what felt like hours, Mark spoke, his voice low but steady. "Do you think there's any chance for peace?" Sereth turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. She had asked herself the same question over and over again in the past few days. Was peace even possible? Could they really end this endless cycle of violence? "I don't know," Sereth said quietly. "I've spent my whole life fighting, believing that war was the only way. I was trained to lead my people to victory, to conquer our enemies." But now, I'm not sure. Mark nodded, his gaze distant. I understand. I've fought my whole life, too. But there's more to life than just fighting. There has to be. Sareth looked out at the stars again, a part of her wishing she could see a future where the war ended, where she could lay down her sword and live without the constant threat of destruction. But that seemed impossible, something that could never be achieved. The Empire, her people, they had been built on war. How could they ever change? Before she could speak again, the pod jolted, and a warning alarm blared. Sareth's eyes snapped open, and she moved quickly to the control panel. "We're being pulled in," she muttered, her hands flying across the buttons. She could see it on the screen. A large Federation cruiser was pulling them in with a tractor beam. "They found us," Sareth said, her voice tense. "We need to break free." Mark quickly stood up, looking at the controls. "It's too late for that. We can't outrun them. If we try, they'll shoot us down." Sareth's fists clenched. She wasn't ready to give up. Not like this. Not after everything they had been through. "We'll fight," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Sarath, wait," Mark said, stepping toward her. "I know you want to keep fighting, but this isn't the answer. We can't just keep fighting forever. If we do, we'll destroy everything." Sareth looked at him, her mind torn. She didn't want to surrender. She had never surrendered in her life. But deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe Mark was right. Maybe this wasn't the way. But just as quickly, her pride surged. She couldn't just give in. Not after everything. Not after the people who had died in the battle. She couldn't turn back now. "We have no choice," Sareth said, her voice firm. "We fight. We survive." Mark stepped back, his eyes darkening. "Then you're making a mistake." Sareth looked at him. But before she could say anything else, a voice came through the pod's communication system. It was crackling, but clear enough. "Unidentified escape pod. This is Captain Lynn of the Federation cruiser Valor. You are surrounded. Surrender immediately, and you will be treated as prisoners of war. Resistance is futile." Sareth's hand hovered over the controls, her mind racing. This was it. They could surrender. They could stop fighting and hope for mercy. Or they could die in battle. The decision was hers. "Sareth," Mark said quietly, his voice gentle. "This isn't the way. We don't have to fight anymore. Let's find another way, please." Sareth's heart pounded in her chest. She had always been the one to lead, the one to make decisions. She had never been afraid of battle, never been afraid of the consequences. But now, standing here with Mark, she felt something she had never felt before. Doubt. She had been trained to fight, to conquer, but was that the only way? The voice of the Federation captain crackled again. "We'll give you one last chance. Surrender. Now." Sareth turned to Mark, her expression conflicted. She had always been strong, always been a warrior. But now, for the first time, she wondered if there was more to life than just war. For a moment there was silence. Then, with a deep breath, Serath spoke. "We surrender," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark's face softened, and for the first time since they had met, Serath saw something in his eyes that made her heart ache. Relief. He had wanted this. He had wanted her to see the truth, to stop the cycle of violence. The Federation cruiser's tractor beam released the pod, and it slowly moved toward the larger ship. Serath's hands gripped the armrests of her seat. She felt as though her whole life had been a lie, that everything she had fought for had been meaningless. But deep down, she knew it wasn't too late. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the ashes of the war. As they docked with the Valor, Serath turned to Mark. She had never asked him why he fought, why he believed in peace, but now she understood. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about something greater. It was about hope. The doors to the escape pod opened, and Serath stepped out, Mark by her side. The Federation soldiers stood waiting, their weapons drawn, but there was no hostility in their eyes. They had won, but they weren't here to take prisoners. They were here to end the war. Serath looked at Mark, the man who had shown her that there was another way. She had been so focused on her past, on the way she had been taught to fight, that she had never considered the future. But now, with Mark beside her, she could see it. A future where there was no more war. A future where peace could finally exist. As she followed the Federation soldiers into the cruiser, she knew the road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road she was willing to walk. Because, for the first time, she had hope.